so much.
Look at you, so weak.
You're just a burden now.
Pathetic. We should just leave.
You have no idea. 30 billion.
She was dying. They all knew it. What none of them knew was that she was also worth $30 billion. There are stories that make you question everything you think you know about loyalty, greed, and the people closest to you. Stories that make you sit back and wonder how a human being can look at the person sleeping next to them every single night and see nothing but a problem to be managed. This is one of those stories. And I need you to stay with me from the very beginning, because nothing, and I mean nothing, about what you're about to hear is what it looks like on the surface. The truth, when it finally came, didn't arrive with fireworks or headlines. It arrived quietly, the way the most devastating truths always do. In an envelope, on an ordinary Tuesday morning. And by the time it was over, every single person in this story had to reckon with exactly who they had been. Before we go any further, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now and let us know where in the world you're watching from. We genuinely love hearing from our community, and it means more than you know. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. We cover stories exactly like this one. Stories that don't make the front page, but absolutely should. Now let's get into it, because this story is just getting started. He was terrified of what his money would do to the people who inherited it, which was both her greatest quality and, as it would turn out, one of the things that made her most vulnerable to what was coming. She graduated from Ohio State University in 1987 with a degree in social work, not because it was a lucrative field, it emphatically was not, but because Margaret Caldwell had spent her entire childhood paying careful attention to the people around her, noticing who was struggling and who was being ignored, and she had concluded, by the time she was old enough to make the decision, that the work of caring for people who had been overlooked by systems that were supposed to help them was worth doing, even if nobody was going to pay you particularly well for it. She worked for 8 years at a nonprofit organization in Columbus, Ohio, that provided housing assistance and case management services to families experiencing homelessness. She was good at it. Not in a way that won awards or generated press releases, in a way that her clients felt and that her colleagues depended on. She was the person in the office who remembered the details. She remembered which client had a daughter starting kindergarten, which family had a father dealing with a medical diagnosis on top of everything else, which case needed a phone call at an inconvenient hour because something had come up and the file couldn't wait until Monday. She was, in the truest sense of the phrase, a person who showed up. And she did this for 8 years, earning a salary that never crossed the threshold of what most people would call comfortable. Living in a one-bedroom apartment in Columbus with 2 cats and a collection of houseplants that she tended to with the same deliberate care she gave everything else in her life. Until the summer of 1994, when a colleague invited her to a company mixer at a bar in the short north neighborhood of Columbus, and Margaret went because she almost never went to things like that and decided, on a particular Thursday evening, that maybe she should. Richard Voss was already there when she arrived. Richard was 33 years old in the summer of 1994, and he was the kind of man who understood, instinctively and without any apparent effort, how to fill a room. He was tall. He dressed well. He had the particular gift of making whoever he was talking to feel, in the moment of the conversation, like the most interesting person he had encountered all year, which is a talent that can either be a genuine expression of curiosity about other people or a very sophisticated form of manipulation. And the difficulty, the real, genuine difficulty, is that from the outside, in the early stages, those two things are almost impossible to tell apart. Richard worked in commercial real estate. He spoke with authority about markets and development and opportunity in the way that men in commercial real estate in the mid-1990s often did, with the particular confidence of someone operating in a sector that was growing and that rewarded the appearance of certainty almost as much as it rewarded actual competence. He had grown up in a suburb of Cleveland, the youngest son of a contractor, and he had spent most of his adult life trying to put distance between himself and that origin, not because there was anything wrong with it, but because Richard Voss had decided early that he was meant for something larger, and he had organized his entire personality around that conviction. He talked to Margaret for 45 minutes that Thursday evening, and at the end of the conversation, he asked for her number, and Margaret, who was thoughtful about most things in her life and perhaps slightly less thoughtful about this one, gave it to him. They dated for 2 years. Margaret's closest friend from college, a woman named Diane Hartley who had known Margaret since freshman orientation and who could read her with the accuracy of a decade of close friendship, later said that she had concerns about Richard almost from the beginning. Not dramatic concerns, not the kind that would have generated a confrontation, but the quiet, persistent kind that accumulate the way small debts do, until one day you realize the total is larger than you had been paying attention to. Diane noticed that Richard had a tendency to redirect conversations back to himself. She noticed that he had a way of casually minimizing things that mattered to Margaret, her work, her opinions, her choices, not with open contempt, but with a particular brand of gentle condescension that was harder to name and therefore harder to challenge. She noticed that when Margaret talked about something she cared about deeply, Richard would listen with every appearance of attentiveness, and then say something that subtly reframed the conversation in a way that made Margaret's perspective seem naive or overly earnest. Diane mentioned some of this to Margaret once, carefully, in the way you mention things to a close friend when you know the relationship is already serious and you are trying to tell the truth without doing damage. Margaret listened. She thanked Diane, and then she told Diane that she thought she was being a little unfair to Richard, that he was still getting comfortable, that he was more complex than he appeared on first encounter. Diane let it go. She would think about that conversation many times in the years that followed. Margaret and Richard were married in June of 1996 at a small ceremony outside Columbus. Her parents came. Her sisters came. Diane was the maid of honor. Richard's family came from Cleveland. His parents, his older brother James, James's wife, and 2 children. The photographs from that day show Margaret looking genuinely happy, which matters to note, because it is easy, looking back from a distance of years and knowing everything that followed, to impose a narrative of inevitability onto a moment that did not feel inevitable at the time. Margaret was not making a mistake she knew was a mistake. She was marrying a man she loved, in front of the people she loved, on a warm day in June, and she was happy. That is the truth of that day. Everything else came later. The first few years of the marriage were what Margaret would later describe, in the careful and precise language she always used, as functional. Not her word for happy, functional. They bought a house in a suburb of Columbus. Richard's real estate work brought in enough to cover the mortgage, and then some. Margaret continued at the nonprofit, though the hours were long and the emotional weight of the work was considerable, and Richard had a way, even in those early years, of making her feel that her career was a kind of hobby, something she did because she liked it, not something that contributed meaningfully to the life they were building together. He never said it outright. He didn't need to. It was in the way he reacted when she came home late because a client had a crisis. It was in the way he talked about her work at dinner parties, with a slightly exaggerated affection that somehow made the work sound less serious than it was. That positioned Margaret as charmingly dedicated to a cause that the adults in the room couldn't be expected to take entirely seriously. Margaret noticed this. She noticed most things, but she had a deep capacity for extending the benefit of the doubt to people she had committed to, and she extended it to Richard with a generosity that, in retrospect, he did not deserve. By 2001, the marriage had settled into a set of patterns that would have been recognizable to anyone who has spent time studying the architecture of relationships, where one person holds the balance of power and exercises it quietly. Richard's real estate business had gone through a rough period. Several deals that hadn't materialized, a partnership that had ended badly, a stretch of months where his income had dropped substantially and his mood had dropped along with it in ways that were felt throughout the house without ever being directly addressed. Margaret had, during this period, taken on additional work, consulting, grant writing, whatever was available, to help stabilize their finances, and Richard had accepted this help without much acknowledgement and without any apparent reflection on what it said about who was carrying the weight. He recovered, as he always seemed to. And when the income came back, the episode was folded into the ongoing narrative of Richard Voss as a man who operated at a scale larger than ordinary setbacks, a man who had the occasional difficult stretch and then came back stronger, which was a story Richard told about himself so often and with such conviction that it had become, in the household, simply accepted as fact. Margaret had heard it enough times that she had stopped noticing when it didn't match the evidence. And then, in the fall of 2003, something happened that changed the nature of everything. Margaret began to get sick. It started with fatigue, not ordinary tiredness, but the specific, relentless exhaustion that sits in your bones and doesn't respond to sleep. That makes the act of getting out of bed in the morning feel like a negotiation between your body and your will. Then the joint pain began, first in her hands, then spreading to her wrists and her knees and her hips. Pain that was inconsistent enough to be easy to dismiss in the early stages, but persistent enough that Margaret, who was not a person who went to doctors unnecessarily, made an appointment. Then another, then a referral, then a specialist in Columbus, then a specialist in Cleveland. The process took the better part of a year, moving through a series of diagnoses that were considered and then set aside until, in the spring of 2004, a rheumatologist named Dr. Patricia Osei delivered the diagnosis that Margaret had, on some level, already been preparing herself for: an aggressive autoimmune condition attacking her connective tissue, her joints, her energy systems, the physical infrastructure of her daily life. The condition was manageable, Dr. Osei explained carefully, with the right combination of medication, physical therapy, lifestyle adjustment, and ongoing monitoring. It was not going to kill Margaret in the near term, but it was going to be a permanent presence. It was going to change things. And it was going to require, in ways that could not be precisely predicted at the outset, that the people around Margaret be willing to absorb some of what she was carrying. Richard Voss was not willing. He didn't leave. That is important to say clearly, because the fact that he stayed is part of what made the dynamic so difficult to name and so difficult to address. He stayed, and he presented himself, to friends, to family, to anyone who might be observing, as a man who had stood by his wife through a difficult medical situation, which is a very particular kind of cruelty, because it is a cruelty that comes wrapped in the appearance of its opposite. Richard did not refuse to take Margaret to her appointments. He simply made her feel, consistently, and through 100 small signals, that taking her to appointments was an imposition he was absorbing out of duty rather than love, that she was costing him something he hadn't signed up to pay, that her illness was a failure of character as much as it was a failure of biology. He began, gradually, and then with increasing frequency, to say things out loud that he had previously only implied. At a backyard gathering with his brother James and James's wife in the summer of 2005, while Margaret was inside resting because her joints were flaring, Richard laughed about her condition in a way that James would later describe, under oath, as dismissive. "Not sick," he said. "Just lazy. Always been lazy." He said it with the particular ease of a man who has said something enough times in private that saying it in public no longer feels like a risk. James laughed, because James didn't know what else to do. Richard's wife Karen, who was standing nearby and who heard it clearly, went quiet in a way that James noticed and didn't ask about until much later. This was not an isolated incident. Margaret's younger sister, Donna, who lived 30 minutes away and who had become, during this period, Margaret's most consistent source of practical support, driving her to appointments when Richard wasn't available, sitting with her during the longer infusion treatments, bringing food on the days when the pain made cooking impossible. Donna kept a record. Not formally, not with any legal intention, but the way people who are watching something unfold and feel helpless to stop it sometimes keep records. In a journal, in text to a trusted friend, in the running tally that accumulates in your head when you are a witness to something wrong. Donna documented the phone call where Richard told her that Margaret was exaggerating her symptoms for attention. She documented the evening she arrived at the house unexpectedly and found Margaret in the kitchen, in pain, having not eaten since morning because Richard had gone to dinner with clients and hadn't thought to check in. She documented the Christmas gathering in 2006 where Richard made a joke, in front of 8 people, including Margaret's mother Helen, about what it was like to be married to someone who couldn't do anything anymore. Helen laughed nervously. Margaret said nothing. Donna watched her sister's face and wrote about it that night in her journal, and what she wrote was this: Margaret looked like someone who had decided a long time ago not to expect anything different and was simply getting through the evening. That was what Donna wrote. And that was, by 2006, precisely what Margaret was doing. The financial dimension of Margaret's illness made everything more acute. She had reduced her hours at the nonprofit substantially, and by 2007 she had stopped working entirely, not because she wanted to, but because the combination of pain, fatigue, and the cognitive effects of her medication made it impossible to maintain the level of presence and attention her work required. She was not someone who stopped working easily. She had built her identity, in meaningful ways, around being useful, around showing up, around being the person who handled what needed handling. Being unable to work was not just a financial adjustment for Margaret. It was an identity loss, and it was one she grieved quietly and without much support, because Richard's response to her stopping work was not to comfort her, but to begin, openly and with decreasing subtlety, to refer to her as a financial burden. He said it to his brother James. He said it to his friend Gary, a man he had known since college. He said it, at least twice, to Margaret directly. Not as an insult delivered in a moment of anger, which might have been easier to process, but as a statement of what he characterized as simple financial reality, the kind of thing a responsible man had to acknowledge even when it was uncomfortable. The household was dependent on his income. Margaret was not contributing. These were facts, and Richard presented them as facts, stripped of the context that might have made them feel like what they actually were, which was an act of sustained and deliberate cruelty toward a woman who was ill and who had nowhere else to go. What Richard did not know, what none of them knew, what Margaret herself had absolutely no idea about, was that in the offices of Hartwell, Greer and Associates in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the people managing the Caldwell Dynasty Trust had been paying quiet and careful attention to everything. They had been tracking the Caldwell family line for years, as was their responsibility under the terms of the trust. They knew about Robert Caldwell's death in 2001. They knew about his daughters, Margaret, Donna, and the eldest, Carol, who lived in Phoenix. They knew that Margaret had turned 45 in March of 2010, and they had been monitoring, through the mechanisms available to an estate law firm managing a trust of this magnitude, the documented evidence of Margaret's adult life, her career in social work, her medical records, the financial records associated with her household, the accumulated evidence of a woman who had, without knowing it, and without any possibility of having arranged it, satisfied every single condition that Edmund Caldwell had written into that trust document in 1971. She was a direct bloodline descendant. She had reached 45. She had made no prior claim to the estate. And she had demonstrated, in ways that were documented and verifiable, and that would have made Edmund Caldwell, had he been alive to read them, feel that he had understood something true about the nature of character and adversity. She had demonstrated hardship of a kind and a duration that left no room for ambiguity. 2 weeks after Margaret's 45th birthday, the firm sent a letter. Not to Margaret, to the marital address. Certified mail. Richard Voss signed for it on a Wednesday morning in April of 2010, in the bathrobe he wore on mornings when he didn't have early appointments, at the front door of the house in the Columbus suburb where Margaret was still asleep in the bedroom because her medication made mornings difficult. He took the letter inside. He opened it at the kitchen counter. He read it. He read it again. And then he folded it back up, placed it in the envelope, carried it to his home office, and put it in the bottom drawer of his desk, underneath a stack of folders related to a development project he had been working on for the previous year. He went to the kitchen, made himself coffee, and when Margaret came downstairs an hour later, he told her good morning and asked if she wanted toast. She said yes. He made it, and he said nothing about the letter. Not that morning. Not the next day. Not the following week. Not for 4 months. What was in the letter was straightforward, though its implications were anything but. Hartwell, Greer and Associates of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, was writing to inform Margaret Elaine Caldwell that she had been identified as the qualifying heir to the Caldwell Dynasty Trust, established in 1971 by her late grandfather Edmund Caldwell. She was requested to contact the firm at her earliest convenience to begin the process of notification and transfer. The letter included a direct line to the managing partner, a man named William Greer, who had joined the firm in the 1980s and had been overseeing the Caldwell file for nearly 2 decades. It did not state the full amount of the trust in the initial letter. That was reserved for the formal notification meeting. But it was explicit that this was a matter of significant financial consequence, and that prompt contact was encouraged. It was, in every sense, a life-changing document. It was sitting in a drawer under a stack of real estate folders. And Richard Voss went about his days. During the 4 months that followed, Richard made a series of decisions that would later be examined in considerable detail by attorneys, forensic accountants, and a judge in Franklin County, Ohio. He opened 2 new limited liability companies, one ostensibly related to a development project, one with a stated purpose that was vague enough to require follow-up questions when it was later reviewed. He transferred $340,000 from a joint savings account that he and Margaret shared into a personal account that Margaret did not know existed, in transactions structured to fall just below the reporting thresholds that would have triggered automatic scrutiny. He had a phone consultation with a divorce attorney named Stephen Marsh, who specialized in high-asset dissolution cases and whose name would later appear in Richard's call records during the period when investigators were reviewing his communications. And he did all of this, every single one of these things, while continuing to live in the house with Margaret, eating dinner across from her, watching television beside her, occasionally driving her to medical appointments, maintaining every appearance of being exactly what he had always been, which was a man who stayed. The most generous interpretation of Richard's conduct during this period, and Richard's own attorney would eventually offer this interpretation at some length in a courtroom, is that he was in shock. That receiving a letter of this magnitude, addressed to his wife, had destabilized him in ways he hadn't fully processed, and that the decisions he made during those 4 months were the decisions of a man who was overwhelmed and frightened and acting without clear intention. This interpretation was available. It was offered. The judge did not find it particularly compelling, and I'll explain why in a moment, but it is worth acknowledging that it existed, because the alternative interpretation, which is that Richard Voss, upon learning that his sick wife was the heir to $30 billion, immediately and deliberately began positioning himself to intercept as much of that inheritance as legally possible before she could be informed of its existence. That interpretation requires you to believe something about a human being that is genuinely difficult to hold in your mind, even when the evidence points there. The evidence pointed there. Hartwell, Greer and Associates had been trying to reach Margaret for 6 months by the time the certified letter arrived. There had been earlier letters to her parents' address in Dayton, which no longer reached anyone since Robert Caldwell's death and Helen's move to a smaller apartment. There had been emails to an address Margaret had used in her early career and had long since abandoned. There had been a phone call to a number that had been reassigned. The firm was not being negligent. They were following the protocols established for exactly this kind of situation, where a qualifying heir had no knowledge of the trust and no reason to be monitoring for contact. But the certified letter to the marital address was supposed to be the solution to all of that. It was supposed to reach Margaret. It reached Richard instead, and Richard made a decision about what to do with it, and that decision set in motion everything that followed. The person who broke the silence was not Margaret. It was not the firm. It was a 26-year-old paralegal named Claire Morrow, who had been assigned to the Caldwell file as part of her caseload, and who had been tasked, as the weeks and then months passed without response from Margaret, with identifying alternative means of contact. Claire was thorough. She was also, by her own later account, troubled by the fact that a woman who was supposed to be receiving significant and time-sensitive legal information about her own inheritance was apparently unreachable through every channel the firm had tried. She searched social media. She found Donna Caldwell, Margaret's sister, who had kept her maiden name after a brief marriage in her late 20s, on a Facebook account that was semi-public. On a Tuesday evening in August of 2010, sitting at her desk after most of the office had emptied out, Claire Morrow sent Donna Caldwell a Facebook message that said, as precisely as Claire could manage within the constraints of what she was permitted to disclose, that she worked for an estate law firm in Philadelphia, that she was attempting to reach Margaret Elaine Caldwell regarding a legal matter of significant importance, that the matter was time-sensitive, and that she would be grateful if Donna could ask Margaret to contact the firm directly at the number she included in the message. She sent it, closed her laptop, and went home, not knowing whether it would be seen, not knowing whether Donna would respond, not knowing that she had just set off a chain of events that would, over the following 3 years, involve multiple courts, a forensic accounting team, a deposition from Richard's brother James, a reconciliation between Margaret and her mother Helen that was long overdue, and a verdict that would be cited in Ohio estate law discussions for years afterward. Donna saw the message the next morning. She called her sister immediately. Margaret picked up on the second ring. She was sitting in the sunroom at the back of the house, which was where she spent most of her mornings during the periods when her symptoms were manageable, reading, or trying to read, or simply sitting in the light because the light helped. Donna explained what she had seen. Margaret listened without interrupting, which was characteristic of her, and then asked Donna to send her the message. She read it. She looked at the phone number. She looked at it for a long moment. And then she called. William Greer, the managing partner at Hartwell, Greer and Associates, answered his own phone, which was not something he typically did, but his assistant was at lunch, and he happened to be passing the desk, and he picked up. He would say, afterward, that he had been managing the Caldwell file for nearly 20 years, and that he had wondered, more than once, what this phone call would feel like when it finally happened. He introduced himself. He confirmed that he was speaking with Margaret Elaine Caldwell, born March 14, 1965, daughter of Robert Caldwell, granddaughter of Edmund. Margaret said yes, she was. He told her that there was a trust. He told her that she was the qualifying heir. He told her that he would like to arrange a formal meeting at the earliest possible convenience to walk her through the complete details, but that he could tell her, in broad terms, so that she understood the scope of what they were discussing, that the trust currently held assets with an estimated value of $30.4 billion, and that she was the sole beneficiary. Margaret said nothing for a moment that Greer later described as lasting about 15 seconds, which is a very long silence on a telephone call. Then she said, very quietly, "I'm sorry. Can you say that number again?" He said it again. She asked him if she could call him back in 1 hour. He said of course. She hung up the phone, sat in the sunroom for 45 minutes, and then went to find Richard. She called Richard into the living room. She placed her phone on the coffee table between them. She said she needed him to listen to something. She called William Greer back and put the call on speaker. And she stood in her living room, in the house she had been sharing with a man who had spent the better part of a decade calling her a liability, and she listened while the attorney confirmed, calmly and in professional detail, the existence of the Caldwell Dynasty Trust, the conditions that had qualified her as its beneficiary, and the approximate current value of her inheritance. She did not look at Richard while this was happening. She looked at the phone. When the call ended, she thanked Mr. Greer and said she would be in touch to schedule the formal meeting. Then she hung up, and then she looked at her husband. Richard Voss did not say what she had been expecting him to say. He did not apologize. He did not reach for her. He sat in the chair across from her, looking at the phone on the coffee table, and then he looked up at her, and he laughed. A short, disbelieving sound, the kind of laugh that has no warmth in it at all, the kind that comes from a place of profound and panicked recalibration. Like it was a joke, like it couldn't be real, like the world had just rearranged itself in a way that he hadn't given it permission to do. And Margaret looked at him laughing, and something settled into place for her, some final, quiet accounting of the preceding 11 years, and she picked up her phone, and she went to the bedroom, and she called Donna. It was real. All of it was real. And she was going to need help figuring out what came next. What came next arrived with considerable speed. Within 72 hours of that phone call, Margaret had retained independent legal counsel, a firm in Columbus with a strong track record in estate and family law, recommended by William Greer as reputable and experienced in matters of this complexity. Within a week, on the advice of her attorneys, forensic accountants had been engaged to conduct a full review of the marital financial records, the joint accounts, the household expenses, the transactions of the preceding years. What they found, beginning with the $340,000 transfer and continuing through the 2 new LLCs and the consultation with the divorce attorney, landed in a legal brief that was filed in Franklin County within 30 days of that phone call. Richard's desk drawer was searched pursuant to a court order. The letter from Hartwell, Greer and Associates, dated April 8, 2010, was recovered, folded, in its original envelope, under a stack of real estate folders, exactly where Richard had put it on a Wednesday morning when Margaret was still asleep. The legal arguments that followed were extensive and, at moments, genuinely complex. Richard's attorney, a skilled litigator named Paul Whitfield who had handled difficult cases before and who was not without resources or ability, argued that Richard's interception of the letter did not constitute a crime. He argued that certified mail delivered to a marital address and signed for by a spouse was, legally, received by the household, not withheld from an individual. He argued that Richard's financial decisions during the 4-month period were not evidence of fraudulent intent, but of a man who was processing a significant and unexpected development and making business decisions that were, individually, within his rights as a partner in a marriage. He argued, with considerable skill, that the narrative being constructed around his client's behavior was emotionally compelling but legally thin. The judge, a 61-year-old woman named the Honorable Sandra Powell, who had been on the Franklin County bench for 14 years, listened to all of this carefully and gave it exactly the weight it deserved, which was not much. She was particularly unpersuaded by the argument that Richard's consultation with a divorce attorney, occurring within weeks of receiving a letter about his wife's $30 billion inheritance, was a coincidence that required no explanation. She was also unpersuaded by the characterization of the financial transfers as routine business decisions, given the timing, the amounts, and the structure of the transactions. She did not rule on every contested point in Margaret's favor, because the law is the law and it does not bend to narrative however compelling, and some of Richard's technical arguments had merit. But the overall finding of the court was clear. Margaret's attorneys had advised her, from early in the process, that the trust assets were very likely protected as separate property under Ohio law, since they derived from an inheritance that predated and was structurally disconnected from the marital estate. This was correct, and it held. Richard was not entitled to the trust. He had never been entitled to the trust. His 11 years of marriage to Margaret gave him no legal claim to her grandfather's fortune, regardless of what he had done or not done, because Edmund Caldwell's structure had been designed, among other things, to be exactly this resistant to exactly this kind of claim. Where things became legally interesting was in the question of what Richard's conduct during those 4 months constituted, and whether Margaret was entitled to damages beyond the simple enforcement of her separate property rights. This question was litigated. It was expensive. It was at times genuinely ugly. And at the end of it, Margaret and her attorneys agreed to a settlement that Richard signed in the spring of 2013, nearly 3 years after the phone call in the living room. He received a portion of the marital assets to which he was legally entitled. He received nothing from the trust. He signed a non-disclosure agreement. And he agreed, as a condition of the settlement that Margaret had insisted upon and that her attorneys had initially questioned because it was unusual and not financially motivated and therefore harder to argue for in a settlement context. He agreed to sit across from Margaret in a mediator's office, without attorneys present, and listen while she read a statement she had written herself. The session lasted 47 minutes. Margaret had written the statement over the course of several weeks, in the sunroom at the back of the house that she had since bought in her own name in a different neighborhood of Columbus. She wrote it the way she had always written things, carefully, precisely, without dramatization, in the plain and specific language of a woman who had spent her career documenting the experiences of people who had been overlooked and who understood that the truth, stated clearly and without embellishment, is generally more powerful than any attempt to make it louder. She read about the dinner parties. She read about the barbecue where he had told his brother she was lazy. She read about the evenings she had spent alone in pain while he was out with clients. She read about the years she had spent doubting her own perception of what was happening in her marriage because Richard was so consistently and confidently certain that her perception was wrong. She read about the day he made the toast and said good morning and said nothing about the letter that was already in the drawer. She read all of it. Richard Voss sat across from her and said nothing. When she finished, she closed the folder. She looked at him for a moment. Then she stood up, thanked the mediator, and walked out of the office. She did not look back. She never saw Richard Voss again. Her sister Donna sits on the Caldwell Foundation board, and has since its founding. Helen Caldwell, Margaret's mother, who had laughed nervously at the Christmas gathering in 2006 when Richard made his joke, and who had never fully forgiven herself for that laugh, was invited by Margaret, 2 years after the settlement, to come and see one of the clinics in rural southern Ohio. Helen came. She was 81 years old by then, and not in great health herself, and she sat in the waiting room of the clinic for a long time looking at the people coming in and the staff at the front desk and the photographs on the wall, and the small printed card near the entrance that said the clinic was made possible by the Caldwell Foundation in memory of Edmund Caldwell. She cried, which was not something Helen Caldwell did easily or often, and Margaret sat beside her and held her hand, and they did not talk about Richard, and they did not talk about the years that had been lost. But Helen said, at some point during that visit, that she was sorry, and Margaret said she knew, and that was enough. It was, by then, enough. Claire Morrow, the paralegal who sent the Facebook message on a Tuesday evening and then went home not knowing what would happen, was hired by the Caldwell Foundation as its first director of communications. She was 28 years old when she took the position. Margaret had tracked her down personally, called her at her desk at Hartwell, Greer and Associates, thanked her specifically and at length, and then offered her the job. Claire, who had been prepared for a thank you call and was not prepared for a job offer, said she needed to think about it. She called back the next morning and said yes. Richard Voss remained in commercial real estate in Columbus, Ohio. His NDA prevented him from speaking publicly about the marriage or the case, and as far as anyone who monitored the matter could determine, he honored it. He continued, by all accounts, to present himself to the world in the manner he always had, with the suits and the handshake and the vocabulary of a man going somewhere. Whether he ever arrived is a question that cannot be answered here, and perhaps it doesn't need to be. What can be said, what this story at its core insists upon, is that Margaret Elaine Caldwell was never what anyone called her. She was not a burden. She was not a liability. She was not dead weight. She was the granddaughter of a man who had thought more carefully about the nature of character than most people think about anything, and who had built a structure designed specifically to find and reward a person who could survive without the thing he was leaving them. Margaret had survived. She had survived illness and dismissal and a decade of being told, in 100 different ways, that she did not matter. She had survived it without losing herself, which is perhaps the most extraordinary thing about her, because the specific cruelty of what Richard Voss did to her was the kind that targets exactly that, the part of a person that knows who they are, the interior certainty that sustains people through difficulty. And it is a very particular kind of damage to have that targeted over years by someone who is supposed to love you. Margaret's interior certainty survived. It survived Richard. It survived the illness. It survived all of it. And when the envelope arrived, when the truth that had been waiting for her for 50 years finally reached her, she was still, underneath everything, exactly who she had always been. Edmund Caldwell had written his conditions into a trust in 1971 and then died believing he understood something true about the relationship between adversity and character. He was right. He just couldn't have known how right he was, or what form the proof would take, or that it would arrive in the form of a woman in a sunroom in Columbus, Ohio, on a Tuesday morning, holding a phone, asking a stranger to say a number again. $30 billion. Yes, she heard it. And what she did with it told you everything you needed to know about who she had always been. Long before the money, long before the marriage, long before any of it. She had always been exactly this person. The world had simply taken a very long time to catch up. I want to leave you with a question that I genuinely don't think has an easy answer, and I want you to think about it before you scroll to the next thing, because it matters. How many people in your life have you looked at the way Richard looked at Margaret? Not with open contempt, perhaps, but with the quiet assumption that they don't have much to offer, that their struggles are their own fault, that the measure of their worth is the measure of what they're currently producing. Margaret Elaine Caldwell was written off by the person who was supposed to know her best. She was written off by a man who had every opportunity to see who she was and chose, instead, to see only what she wasn't. And he was wrong in every direction. The woman he called deadweight was the heir to $30 billion and the founder of 17 medical clinics, and the person who, on a Tuesday morning in August of 2010, quietly changed the lives of more people than Richard Voss will ever count. That is the story, and I think it deserves to sit with you for a while. What part of Margaret's story hit you the hardest?